In this episode, we will discuss experiences with fellowships. A fellowship is a unique opportunity that provides both scholarship funding and various professional work and enrichment opportunities for a specific group of students at various colleges and universities. Today, you will hear from both a current fellow, Raymi, and an alumni, Rodrigo, from the US Latinx Leadership Fellowship at Harvard's Kennedy School. The US Latinx Leadership Fellowship brings together a diverse and talented group of emerging leaders who are committed to working to reduce disparities in their communities through efforts in public policy, education, economic development, healthcare, immigration, social entrepreneurship, and a variety of other fields. Now, let's meet our guests. We begin today's conversation on fellowships with Raymi, a current fellow at the US Latino Leadership Fellowship. Hi, Raymi. How are you?
Hi, Cody. How are you? I'm good.
Good. Thank you for being here. We so appreciate you being a part of the podcast.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So, Raymi, before we get started, I would love for you to have an opportunity to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, so I'm Raymi. I'm a policy student at the Harvard Kennedy School and a US Latinx Leadership Fellow in its Center for Public Leadership. And I am an immigrant from the Dominican Republic, grew up in New York City and attended elementary, middle school, high school there. And more recently, I've worked in college access and retention and at the intersection of human rights and higher ed, as well as immigration policy and advocacy.
Great. You mentioned before that you are a first-generation student, and I wondered, when did you first know you were a first-generation student, and what were your initial thoughts or reaction?
Yeah, so college was just generally a big mystery to me. I did not have anyone in my family who had attended, and there wasn't a clear-cut path created for the students at the high school that I attended. I went to a very economically and racially segregated high school in New York City where almost every student was Black or Latinx or both, and the overwhelming majority were low income and also would be first-generation college students. Were they able to make the leap and make it to college? And so I think growing up, I just didn't have anyone around who had gone to college, with the exception of teachers and professionals that interacted with me. And so there wasn't that awareness. And I think because my parents, my mother and father completed 8th and 6th grade respectively in our home country, they couldn't really navigate the school system here because of language barriers. And so I didn't have a lot of awareness until I spoke with a college counselor at my high school who provided, so I just didn't have any awareness until I reached high school and my college counselor began to work with me on the college process. And so I think in addition to all the overt barriers, I began to understand also that my immigration status was going to be an issue in going to college. And so I began to understand the implications of that and how getting to and through college would be much harder for me because there wasn't a clear path on how to get there.
Right. Now, today, we're here to talk about fellowships. So that's the topic of today's episode. And in your own words, can you define or describe what a fellowship is?
Yeah, so a fellowship is typically a merit-based award, but not necessarily. And it can, but doesn't necessarily include funding. And usually there is a component in addition to funding to focus on personal and professional development and community building. So it's taking some of the passions of the fellows and honing and harnessing those to propel them to make change in whichever way they intend in society.
Awesome. And when did you first learn about or hear about what a fellowship was?
So my first time learning about a fellowship was when I was an undergraduate at Hunter College in New York City. And there in my final semester, I was an Eva Grove Fellow. And the goal of that fellowship was to provide mentorship, professional development, and some financial awards to fellows who were committed to public service, policy, and human rights. And I think that was my first interaction with a fellowship application and with what a fellowship meant.
Great. And can you describe or explain the process that one goes through when applying for a fellowship?
So there's typically an application process that includes a lot of the demographic information. And in addition to that, you would submit essays about your goals and passions and struggles and heartbreaks. And typically, in addition to that, there may be an interview. So in my case, my fellowship applications for graduate school were connected to my graduate school applications.
And what would you say was the most challenging part of the process for you as an applicant for fellowships?
I think the most difficult part was the deep introspection that makes for compelling writing. I think in this case, it meant reflecting on my life, thinking about where I come from, where I want to go, and what impact I want to have. I think that requires a lot of self-knowledge that can be uncomfortable. And it also requires thinking very deeply about our heartbreaks, our fears, and figuring out what you want to do for the rest of your life is no small feat. And it may have meant that the writing process for my essays was very emotional.
Yes, that's a challenging part of the process, to talk so openly about potential barriers or challenges that you've experienced. Did you include anyone in that process? Did you ever, talk to friends or colleagues or family members about the application or some of the writings that you included?
Yeah, so I was very lucky to have the help of a fellowship advisor at my undergraduate institution who was helping me draft my essays. But I think that it was really helpful to be able to explain my story to different audiences to sort of see what they were responding to. And so I think that conversations with friends and family sometimes what's helpful. And sometimes it wasn't an outright, can you look at my essay? But perhaps just a conversation about brainstorming or particular aspects of the essay.
Awesome, exactly. And what motivated you, or potentially who motivated you at the end of the day to really apply for the fellowship opportunity?
I think that a big factor for me was that coming from a low income family, and even though I had been working for a few years, I think funding was a big consideration on whether I would be able to attend graduate school and which one I would choose. And so I think that was the initial motivation. But I think that in applying to some of the prestigious institutions that I ended up applying to, I think it was very helpful to have the support and encouragement of my fellowship advisor in reminding me that I was capable and worthy of getting a fellowship and that I fit the description of what they were expecting of applicants in a way that sometimes, because of messaging and conditioning, it's really hard to see yourself as inhabiting all of the characteristics that fellowships outline as being part of their requirement.
Right. Yeah. And, I think that you mentioned kind of, seeing yourself within the scope of being a low income student. I think that also sometimes students being in the scope of being a first generation student sometimes maybe don't see themselves in various arenas, right? Or maybe see themselves fitting in, so to speak, in different areas. And, that's a great point. And it leads me to wonder, in your own words, how has being a first generation student or maybe a first generation low income student, how has that impacted your identity within being in a fellowship?
Yeah, I think that in contrast to my undergraduate institution or my high school, I think being at Harvard, being at the Center for Public Leadership makes me hyper aware of my first generation to attend college status because there are so few of us and it becomes more pronounced. I think that, for example, this can be evidenced to a recent talk that I attended where an economist advised a room of students to, really get to know people who are poor to be able to decide which policies are going to be best for them. And because there's a lot of overlap between first generation to attend and low income students, I think that illustrates some sort of erasure of the few in the room who end up here. And I think it's evidence that there's a problem when spaces exclude us to this extent, where something like this becomes a very novel idea. I think we have to be really honest about that problem in order to fix it. But I think that in terms of identity, it just became more pronounced. And I just become more hyper aware of the fact that I am a first generation student.
Yeah, and we talk about so many times when it comes to policy change or any sort of large scale decisions, having a seat at the table, right? And so if people at the table don't necessarily know of the barriers or challenges to marginalized populations, sometimes the greater need for those populations can be maybe forgotten about or passed aside. So I think that's really awesome that you mentioned that specifically. So thank you for that. So going back to fellowships, I know you mentioned the application process, but were there any specific requirements that you had to meet? Obviously there were the steps of the application, but what were the requirements for you in terms of being able or eligible to apply?
Yeah, so for the US Latinx Leadership Fellowship, the first requirement is admission to the Harvard Kennedy School. And so that's a separate application process with testing and essays and resume and things like that. And then in addition to that, for the fellowship, you submit an additional essay outlining a topic that you are passionate about as it pertains to reducing disparities in US Latinx communities. And you write about your experiences as it relates to this topic, but also as it relates to your leadership and your public service aspirations. And after that is submitted, that's you can sort of frame that as being that additional round. Then there's a round of interviews with the program managers at the center who ask a lot about your aspirations as a rising public service leader.
Great. Now, how did you feel going into the interview stage, and how did you kind of prepare or feel going into that?
I think that during the application process, I struggle with believing that I should be applying or that I would meet the requirement or that I was the qualified applicant. And I think that sort of imposter syndrome that a lot of first generation college students experience is very real and sometimes creeps up in moments when you least expect it. So I think going into the interview, I felt a lot of that. And sometimes what I do whenever I'm really nervous about that is just like play some music that will hype me up, play some Kendrick or some Cardi B or whatever may work in the moment. And also just reminding myself that I just needed to do my best and I needed to take the advice of others and the learnings in that moment and just trust the process, be vulnerable, take those lessons and do my best. And after the interview was over, just be able to like let it go because everything in my power had already been done. So it's a lot of the internal dialogue of like, I belong here. I deserve to have gotten this interview. I am deserving of getting support to follow my aspirations. And those reminders are really helpful.
Absolutely. And we've talked so much about imposter syndrome on this podcast. And I always tell my first generation students that I work with, having been a first generation student, that belief is a really powerful word. Having belief in yourself, and however you find that, whether, like you said, it's listening to music to encourage you or anything, I think that's, yes, believing that you can do it is a lot of pieces of the puzzle. So, all right. Well, continuing on, you talked about how the fellowship is not just funding. So it's not just financial funding. What other benefits would you like to highlight, or do you think is really of note in a fellowship structure?
Yeah, so I think that in addition to the funding, the goal is to create a community of like-minded individuals who have similar goals. who can bounce ideas off each other, who can network, who can connect each other to opportunities, who can create a safe space for personal development and growth. So one thing that is a component of the US Latinx Leadership Fellowship is that fellows can lead their own workshops, for example, for other fellows. So if somebody has a particular interest or talent in op-ed writing and they realize that others have that, they can lead a workshop on that. If somebody's really good at online branding and presence, they can lead a workshop for that. So I think that sort of like community of support is really important, especially if, as I mentioned, oftentimes you're one of many of the few in when it comes to identity because of, the history of exclusion in higher ed institutions. I think it's really helpful to have that community to be able to do that. But it's also just like, it's really empowering to be in a space of a community who is rooting for you and who is looking out for you and making sure that you're okay, making sure that you have a space outside of classes to explore your interests and your passions.
That's awesome. And I think, as first generation students, we're all looking for that community feel. So that's really cool that you were able to kind of highlight that as a part of the many benefits of being in a fellowship. Going back to the applying discussion, when you were applying, do you remember having a mindset or knowing of how competitive this process was? I know you had to obviously get entrance to other first steps and prerequisites to be eligible to apply. But do you remember having an understanding of how competitive this application process was? And did you even know anyone else who may have been also applying?
Yeah, I didn't know of anyone who was applying for a fellowship or who at the time was applying to the Kennedy School. Prior to applying, knew one person who had attended, but during the application process, I didn't know anyone. And I also did know that such a small percentage of students got funding, something close to about 10%, but I don't want to misquote the numbers. And so I think that even within that, I think that there were other sort of categories that made a fellowship more competitive. And so I did have a sense, especially because of the extent of support that the fellowship was providing, that it was very competitive. And I think that I almost approached it as if it was going to be a no, but it was sort of like a protection mechanism where I was just striving to do my best, but almost assuming that it would be a no so that I could save myself from the disappointment. But that's another thing, is that I think one of the lessons is to not reject yourself. It's not the job of you as a first generation college student to say no to yourself, and you say no by not applying to something because of fear of rejection. So rejection may come, rejection is part of life, but it is, I think for me, it was just like, it was not my job to reject myself from the opportunity. And I wasn't going to be taking that role and applying it to myself. So it was about taking the risk, even if it was competitive.
Totally. And I'm so glad you said that, because I feel like I say a lot of times to students, not limiting oneself, right? Like we're in the control of a lot of things, and sometimes students want to limit themselves and maybe they don't think or expect certain things, but simply just applying, right? Throwing your name into the ring is such a powerful step. So that's great. Is there anything else that you wish you knew back when you applied?
I think that in addition to recognizing that even though these labels can be intimidating, that I needed to sort of believe in myself, because I think that, believing in the power you bring and the valuable experiences that you may bring because of your identity is really important, just when it comes to changing the way our society looks. But I think that the reason you are first generation to attend is very, very likely due to a history of racist, classist exclusion. And so when you read terms on an application that say we're looking for the best and brightest, know that that has historically been a very narrow definition of who could be those things, and that you are those things. And it may sound cliche, but I think that's a really hard, that's a continuous thing to remind yourself. I also would say that vulnerability is a strength. I think when you're thinking about how to tell your story to others that you'll be meeting for the first time, or how to put your story on paper, I think that our stories are unique only to the extent that we're willing to risk being vulnerable. I think that vulnerability in my essays and in my interviews and the risk that I took about my fears and my goals perhaps made it a more memorable conversation. I think getting honest and getting specific can be hard if for people who have experienced trauma, but I also think that reframing vulnerability as a strength can be really helpful in how you tell your story and how you tell others about your goals.
Yeah, totally. No, vulnerability, yes, I say this with a lot of the students that I work with as well, and it can really lead to some powerful self-actualization or some powerful discussions. So that is, yes, co-signing that for sure.
Thank you.
Yes. So we've talked about kind of the process of applying for fellowships, the various benefits, the lessons learned. But now, I'd really love to talk a little bit about where we go from here. Where you see this opportunity taking you. We hear the term change makers a lot, and it sounds like this fellowships can really offer you that ability to be that change maker in several different communities. So my first question in this area would be, how do you believe the US Latinx Leadership Fellowship how do you plan to leverage your leadership abilities and skills that you've gained through this experience to best impact underserved or marginalized communities?
I want to be able to improve policies for low income Black and Brown communities. And I think I would love to do that across education and immigration and criminal justice systems. And I think that being surrounded by the community that I have in the US Latinx Leadership Fellowship and the other fellowships at large has given me the confidence to be a better advocate. And I think that that was one of my goals in thinking about my graduate school aspirations was I wanted to be a bolder advocate. I wanted to be a more honest advocate. I wanted to bring the voices of the people from whom I've learned so much into spaces that I recognize we've been excluded from. And I think that policy change, it can be defined in many different ways, and change making can be defined in many different ways. But the way that I like to think about it is that nothing should be considered meaningful change unless the people who are directly impacted can confirm it. But also that a lot of the change that is sometimes labeled as transformative can be merely symbolic. And I think that having more representative policymakers and more representative policy making can counter the fact that a lot of change is symbolic, because I don't think that we should be letting policymakers get away with not doing what they need to do for communities. But I also think that people in affected communities should be the ones changing policy and should be the ones getting credit for a lot of the policies that we've been changing.
Absolutely. And you've talked about a few causes that are super near and dear to your heart, causes and initiatives that you're really passionate about: education, immigration, criminal justice. How do you think, specifically or maybe generally, how do you think these causes and support or change, substantial change for these causes, could be addressed through your work within the fellowship?
Yeah, so I think that for addressing inequity in immigration, education, wealth, and income, all of which I also see as falling under the umbrella of racial justice. I think that it's really helpful to learn from people who've been doing this work. And I think a lot of the fellows are coming from different policy areas, have a very have a focus on equity and justice. And so you have students who are also at the medical school, or students who have a background in health policy or criminal justice policy. And we're all in that room thinking about how we can potentially make society more just and more equitable. And so I think that's one of the beauties of graduate school, is that people are coming with a lot of work experience many times. And that work experience, coupled with the lived experience, coupled with being in rooms, people who have been doing this work for a long time, can help us see what hasn't worked and why it hasn't worked, and sort of narrow our focus that way.
Great. And, a big question. You will be a Harvard graduate, and I'm curious, what does that mean to you truly at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think that part of understanding the prestige that can be associated with an institution like Harvard means that we have to be really honest about what creating that prestige entailed. And by definition, I think prestige thrives on the history of exclusion, and that exclusion has been the exclusion of people that I aim to work with and on behalf of as I move on in my career. And that exclusion has been that of a lot of Black and Latinx students, like the ones in my high school, for example. And so part of my responsibility is to highlight the brilliance of the communities that I part of my responsibility is to highlight the brilliance of the communities that I stand for, and highlight their brilliance in the places that I have either the privilege or the responsibility to inhabit currently.
Awesome. Going off of that, what hopes do you have for future cohorts of fellows, for the students that go to your high school, for future first-generation students? What are some of the hopes you have for the future of our society?
Yes, that's a very big question. And I like to think about it a lot as a policy student, because I think that we need to have an ideal, right? We need to have an ideal of what society should look like. Otherwise, there's no way of measuring success. And I think that for me, the ideal society is the one that we would choose if we didn't know where we would end up in that society, right? If we didn't know our race, our gender, our class, and all the other identities that unfortunately determine which opportunities you get currently. And so I think for first generation college students and for future fellows, I hope that they are able to have support and financial freedom and faith and trust in their talents, in their brilliance, in their ability to create change, in their boldness, in their courage, and to be able to claim their space. I think we all deserve to explore our passions. I think that is key to building a democratic and free society. And so I hope that they are all able to reflect on what that means for them, and to have the financial and community support to get there.
That's great. Yeah, and that gets at the heart of just so many things. I mean, we always sometimes ask students or really anyone big picture questions, what could you do? What would you do if money was not a factor, or if location was not a factor, or, like the different potential barriers for students? So that's a great future forward thinking, and I look forward to getting there someday. So that's super, super awesome. So Raymi, as we finish up today's interview and discussion, I would just like to thank you for being here. But also, before you go, I would love if you would be interested in sharing any final messages, tips, suggestions, or words of inspiration for our first generation audience.
I would just reiterate that when an application says they're looking for the best and brightest, there is no reason why that can't be you. And so, again, don't reject yourself. I think accepting your abilities is the first step towards having others support you in your path.
Awesome. That's a great message to leave off on. So thank you, Raymi, so much for being a part of this discussion. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Cody, and thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing.
Continuing our conversation on fellowships, we now bring you Rodrigo. Hi, Rodrigo. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. We're super excited to have you on the podcast to share your experiences. So, Rodrigo, before we get started, today we're here to talk about fellowships. But before we get started on that topic, if you can please introduce yourself to our audience, that would be great.
Of course, I'd love to. My name is Rodrigo Dorado, and I am originally from Tepic, Nayarit, Mexico, and I was there for about 9 years before I migrated to Phoenix, Arizona when I was 9 years old and settled there. I had the opportunity to go to a public elementary school in South Phoenix, and there I met an amazing educator whose name is Chad Gueston, and he was a Teach for America teacher. So you can kind of get a sense that I went to one of these public schools that was being targeted because it was by Teach for America, because it was a very low performing school. And from my memory, I could say, yes, it was not one of the best public schools, but that educator, Chad Gueston, really, really helped our class a lot. And me especially, I think, when I came to the US, I was undocumented, and so my family just had no idea of, even my mom didn't even know if I could go to school. So for the first 2 or 3 months of school, I was just at home or followed her to work because she didn't know that she could enroll me in school. But then she talked to some of her friends that she made and found that, oh yes, like Rodrigo and his little sister can go to school. So she enrolled us in school. And so just that whole experience was very new to us. And my mom had this dream to help us. She crossed the border to ensure that we could have a better future. And so she engaged with my Teach for America teacher, Chad Guest. And, he was really kind and offered to help. And over the course of 2 or 3 years that I was his student, he kind of noticed that I had a lot of potential and helped me to apply to one of the best high schools in Arizona. It's a private Jesuit school in North Phoenix. And so I applied and actually got accepted and received a scholarship to go there. And it was an amazing experience being there at this high school where there was a lot of resources, great teachers. And it was just a very, very different experience. It was a big culture shock going to a private institution where it was mostly white students, whereas before I had been at a public institution where everyone was Latino or Black. There were very few white students. And so when I was there in Arizona, there was a law that passed that said that undocumented students couldn't pay in-state tuition to go to college. So we had to pay 400% more to go to school than students that had been born in the U.S. or that were residents of the U.S. And I just remember I really lost all hope, but I was able to get a scholarship to go to another private college, and that's kind of how I made it to college. And it was a tough high school experience trying to figure everything out. But I'm really glad for my parents and my educators because they really supported me and helped me along the way, both like emotionally and with a lot of tips and tricks of how to get into college. And then I attended Santa Clara University on the Hurtado Scholarship, kind of like a fellowship. And after that, I graduated and studied economics. And then I worked in the education nonprofit sector for a while until I decided it was time to apply to graduate school. Went to and applied for the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and was accepted. And I also applied for another fellowship there that's called the US Latino Leadership Fellowship. I was able to receive that fellowship, and now I went to graduate school. I graduated, and now I'm back home and I'm really excited about the next steps. And yes, I'd love to talk about the US Latinx Leadership Fellowship with you and kind of break it down and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great. And, I'm curious, when did you first realize you were a first generation college student? And do you remember any of your initial thoughts or reactions around that identity?
Yeah, definitely. I think that specific phrase like first generation, I don't think that I actually learned that till I was in the process of actually applying to different scholarships and colleges. I really first realized that I was a first generation student in the US when my parents and I attended a college application workshop that was being hosted by my high school. So they cover FAFSA, they cover the college admissions process. And the workshop was in English, and my parents don't speak English, so they could not understand anything. And it was really only up to me to handle the process. So that's kind of when I realized that, oh my God, I'm kind of doing this on my own because my parents, they don't have any specific tips or tricks on the specifics of the process of applying to college. They had always wanted me to go to college. And even though they studied in Mexico, it was very difficult for them to kind of hold my hand through the process here in the US. And then when you add to that the fact that, my parents didn't understand English, they didn't understand the process, I was undocumented. And that meant that I didn't have access to financial aid or the FAFSA or in-state tuition. And it made things so much harder. And for me, this was one of the situations that actually helped me to get to a point where I knew I had to reach out to my teachers and my college counselors to tell them about my immigration status. And, just to give you a sense, this is like senior year, like deep into the fall semester already. Like college applications are doing like 2 months or something like that. And, for the first time, I'm kind of reaching out to my college counselors who probably at that time had always thought like, why is the student not reaching out to us? They're like a great student. They do their homework. They're doing well. They're getting by. Why are they not like reaching out to us? So I finally reach out to them, and that's when they say, okay, like, thank you for letting us know. Now we know how we can help you. And from there, they started helping me identify colleges that would be friendly to undocumented students. They started sending me information about scholarships, and it just made a huge difference. The fact that they were there for me, and specifically, like one of the ways that I was able to find out about Santa Clara University is because the high school where I went and that university, they're both Jesuit schools. So a lot of times they recruit. The university recruits students from that high school. And that's how I was able to find out about the school, because one day my counselor just made me go to one of their information sessions that they hosted at the high school. And that's the first time that I met one of their admissions counselors, and they talked to me and they said, no matter where you were born or anything like that, or your immigration status, like you can apply to this school and there's resources. And I'm just like very, very glad that my high school, had counselors that were helpful. And I'm glad that like that situation made me kind of want like reach out to them, to be honest, because that's one of the things that I learned very early on, is that I had to reach out to people to get support, because I thought my situation was really unique, and it wasn't. There were a lot of other students that went through the same thing that I went through, that are going through it. And I'm really glad that I opened up to my teachers and they were able to help.
That's great. So now we want to discuss the fellowship. And you were a fellow, you're an alumni of, as you mentioned, the US Latinx Leadership Fellowship at Harvard. And I'm curious, going back to your fellowship days, what initially motivated you to even apply for the fellowship?
No, that's a really good question. And what really motivated me was I had been working in the nonprofit education space for about 6 years, and I had been working as a program manager. So I was implementing different programs and events and outreach to students based on policies that had been set by either the state legislature or another type of agency. And a lot of times I would find myself disagreeing with some of these policies or the way that it was run. Sometimes I felt like, this is not enough enough for the communities that we're serving. This is too little. This could be done better. And, I wish that the individuals that are making these decisions at the higher level could listen to me and to my coworkers, because I think we'd have amazing ideas to share with them. So obviously was very, very confident in the way that I felt. And when I looked to these higher levels where people have more power to make policies, I saw that a lot of times there was not a lot of Latinos in those positions of power. And I felt like whoever was there could be doing a better job. And I decided, I think that I could be one of these individuals. And if I study policy and government, I could be in those positions one day, and I could represent and be more representative of the communities that these policies are looking to serve. And so that's what motivated me. And to give just a concrete example, I was working in Phoenix, and we were working on supporting students apply to FAFSA. So I created an app that would help our staff at my organization better communicate and target students at the high school district to get them to apply for financial aid and to coach them through it. So to set up appointments and the like. And one of the cool things that we were able to create was we created a data sharing agreement between the district and the organization. And that really helped us to have access to the students and really target students that were doing well in school, but who might not have been thinking that they wanted to go to college. And it was an amazing experience because we were able to see every student, their GPA, and target all these students that maybe they just hadn't thought about college, or maybe they had applied for FAFSA, but they didn't know there was a specific scholarship that applied to them. And I really liked the fact that we were able to have access to that data. And the way that happened is because the superintendent of that district, he was okay with sharing information because he knew it was going to help his students who would otherwise not get that type of support. And the interesting thing about this superintendent is that he was my Teach for America teacher when I was in elementary. And so I knew that he had a different perspective of how to support students. And that was kind of the moment where I said, if my teacher can do it, he can become one of these decision makers and make things better for his students, then I should be able to do that too. And for me, that's what really motivated me and said, okay, I've been thinking about applying for this fellowship. Let me stop thinking about it and let me actually schedule some time and put it on my calendar and start writing this application.
Yeah, and oftentimes that's the first step, is just pushing yourself to do it, taking that first step. And it's awesome that you decided to do it and that you had such great motivation behind that. So that's awesome. We've talked some about what this fellowship has done and for you, and sometimes it's the financial aspect. There are financial benefits, but fellowships are more than just the financial aspect, right? So what are some of the other benefits or ways in which the fellowship helped you the most?
Definitely. I think in one respect, it was the support of other fellows that come from a similar background that are also Latinx or identify as Latinx. And we would basically have a weekly meeting every Wednesday, and we'd meet for dinner and do activities, do workshops and things like that. And just for one, it was really helpful to have a community at a institution like Harvard that just knew where I was coming from. I think, it's a culture shock when you go to private schools because people have they carry themselves in a different way. Their experience, their lived experiences are different. And so they kind of live the world a little bit differently, just like anyone would that maybe comes from a different line of work or a different school or a different state. And so it was great to have a community of people that, where I could express myself just the way that I wanted to, sometimes even in Spanish, or tell jokes in Spanish, and they would get it because, they're from the same background. So that was really important for me because I felt like no matter how I was doing that week, I knew that on Wednesday I would get to have a sit down in the dinner with my friends and my community of peers that identify as Latinx and first generation. And that was just amazing throughout the 2 years that I was there. So I really liked that. And then, like you mentioned, the fellowship also provides opportunities for mentorship, for networking. in not this specific fellowship, they also provide workshops around leadership. And so I just remember every other week we would go to different workshops. One of my favorite ones was when we had to do a presidential simulation. So we simulated this scenario where we were in the White House and we were in a military situation. And it was a lot of fun because some of the individuals that were helping to run the simulation had worked at the White House, were members of the military. They were former generals that worked with some former presidents. And it was just really memorable because the entire time I was in shock that this was even happening. And even though it was a simulation, it felt so real because the general, he brought his uniform. And I just remember all the leadership lessons that I learned in that scenario, like, really stand out to me today. Like, I remember them very vividly because it was a scenario that we played out versus some of the things I learned in class that I, to be honest, can't really remember. So I really like that about the mentorship, that it really got us out of our comfort zone and taught us things in new ways. On the other hand, it was also not easy. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the first time that they had given out this type of fellowship to Latinx students. And so me and the other two people that had the fellowship, we were the first ever people to have this fellowship. And so it was a little bit tougher to not have direct access to mentors or alumni, or even any sort of stories of like, what have previous fellows have done? Like, it was all very new. But thankfully, through the fellowship, there are people that manage the fellowship. They manage the program. They make sure that there's workshops for us, that we're building community. And I just remember becoming very attached to our program manager and really building community with her throughout the 2 years. And that was also a really great benefit of being in the fellowship. I feel like, she's going to be someone that I continue to connect with, like, over the coming years. So it was really great. And then as part of the fellowship, you also have access to all the alumni that have been part of the school who have also been fellows. And they even have like this mobile app where you can connect with them. And I also think that that's really cool. I've reached out to one alumni in the past and was able to connect with them to talk about affordable housing. And it's really cool just to know there's people out there that have had a similar experience. They had a fellowship, and I can just reach out to them and say, hey, I was a fellow too. But even though I was a fellow like 5 years after you, we have this thing in common. Can I talk to you? That's a really cool thing to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And what were some lessons that you've learned from fellowship experiences, from applying, that you would like to provide, other students who might be listening right now, who might be interested in fellowships or similar programs? What are some lessons learned that you would offer to them about your experience?
Definitely. When I was in high school and I was having, like, pretty much, I would call it an emotional meltdown. I was in this place where I was in the process of applying to colleges and scholarships, and there was not a lot of scholarships that I qualified for because of my immigration status. And I was very, very freaked out that I wouldn't get accepted into colleges, even if I did get accepted, would they even want to fund me? And I got very lucky because I applied to a lot of different colleges, and there was one specific college in Seattle, Washington, Seattle University, that accepted me and sent me the first financial aid offer I had ever received. So imagine this undocumented student going to the mail, picking up this huge envelope from Seattle University, opening it up, and it says, "Hey, we'd love to have you at our university. We loved your personal statement, and we want you to come here. So we'll pay $10,000 out of your $30,000 tuition." And my immediate thing was like, oh my God, this feels so amazing. Like, somebody's actually willing to take a gamble on me. And then immediately saying like, man, like, I don't have $20,000. This is terrible. And then I went to my teachers. I went to Mr. Johnson the next day and I told him, hey, look, I got this package from Seattle University. And they said they're willing to pay for 1/3 of my tuition. And he said, that's awesome. And he said, tell them that you'll go there if they pay for your whole tuition. And I said, what? He's like, yeah, just send them an email and ask them, would they be willing to pay for your entire college if you go to their school? And I was shocked. I asked, like, I was kind of in my mind thinking, are you sure? Like, are you sure they're gonna, like, they're already giving me $10,000. Like, they're not gonna give me more. And he just was adamant. He's like, you have nothing to lose. Like, the worst they can say is no. Go and ask if they'll pay your whole way. And he said, you know what, matter of fact, just get your computer out and type this email out. And so I typed out the email, hey, thank you so much for the offer. I really enjoyed it. And then he told me, like, explain your situation, like, let them know why you're asking what you're asking for. And I said, I come from a low income family. I'm undocumented. I don't have access to financial aid or blah, 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 blah. I would love to go to your university. Could you, could you pay for my entire tuition? So I sent the email, and then I waited for what seemed like forever. And about 2 weeks later, they sent me another huge mail in the package. And they said, yes, we would like to offer you a full tuition scholarship so that you can come to Seattle University. And I said, what? And I went to talk to Mr. Johnson, and I said, how did you know this was going to happen? And he told me, here's the thing. Like, a lot of students that are applying to college think that they're the ones that are pursuing the schools, but a lot of the times it's the other way around. The schools are looking for students. They're looking for talent that they can get into their universities, and they're willing to support great students financially if they end up going to their schools, because they know that they're going to make the campus a better place to learn, and they're going to create a better community for all the other first generation students. That's why. And I feel like ever since then, I've always tried to convey in one way or another kind of that story, because it shocked me as a 17-year-old at the time that I should ask for more money.
I have so many conversations like that with the students and families I work with. So that's a great point, and I'm glad that you brought that up. Awesome. And we've talked a lot about the fellowship and your experience, but I'd love to talk about kind of what you've been able to do and what you will be able to continue to do post-fellowship. And so I'd love to know, how do you plan to leverage the leadership skills and abilities that you really honed in on while in the fellowship to best serve underserved or marginalized communities?
Definitely. So the work that I'll be going into deals with developing affordable housing, and this is it's a very unique process, because there's a part of this process that is done usually by a private company, but then there's also a part of the process that involves the government and the community. So everyone in a way has a say in terms of what gets built. What is it going to look like? Is there going to be like a community pool? Is there going to be places to walk? Is there going to be bike racks? Like different, how big should the rooms be? There's a lot of decisions that are up to the community, the government, and the private organizations that build the housing. And what I see a lot, and what I've been told by other fellows who've been in the space, is that a lot of times negotiations break down because the different communities, the different stakeholders don't find an agreement. And when I was a part of the fellowship, I felt like what I really honed in was trying to learn and become better at communicating, and especially thinking about how you communicate cross-culturally, or, if you just have different perspectives, how can you find that common ground that'll help you reach some sort of agreement and potentially, make compromises. And so I hope that I can use those leadership skills to support both the company that I'll work for, but also the government and the community to reach an agreement that works for everyone and that enables the building of more affordable housing. And I'm really passionate about, being a voice for the community within my company, because a lot of the affordable housing that we will potentially build will actually be built in the neighborhoods where I grew up. And so I feel like for me, just being from this place just means that I want to make sure that people have a voice in the process, and that I advocate within the organization for some of the demands that the community might have of an affordable housing developer.
Great. And that's a great segue into my next question, which is, what role has serving others within your own community played in your personal life and development professionally?
Definitely. I think to me, it's always been like a very interesting concept. The first ever time where I kind of I came into know this idea of serving others was when I was in high school. The high school was a kind of religious high school where there was a requirement that every year you did like 50 hours of service. And it was a funny concept to me because like some of the students, what they would do is they would go and volunteer or do service at like St. Vincent de Paul, which is like food pantry. And then they also provide like doctors and health for community members. And I just always remember it was like a funny thing to me because I would go to me and my family, we would go and get our health checkups at St. Vincent de Paul, and sometimes we would have to go and get food there too because we were very low income, and it was like this really weird concept where I was like, whoa, like I'm supposed to be like volunteering and helping others, but at the same time, like I need to be helping myself and my family, and I just feel like I don't see this as like this idea of serving others or volunteering. I just see it as being part of my family, being part of my community, because where I grew up, we all needed to help each other, and we all needed to give tips and tricks to each other. Like, where do you go get food? You go to like St. Vincent de Paul, St. Mary's, or, there's a lot of people in the community where I live, for example, it's mostly elderly Black individuals that migrated to South Phoenix in the 1960s. So most of them they're like, I would say at least minimum in their 70s. And so I grew up just cleaning their yards and doing a ton of chores for them because they just needed it, and they're our neighbors, and that's something that my community did. And so I feel like that's how I see it. I just see it as, it's not like this idea of service. It's just what you do as a human. You help other people that you see in your community that need help. And when I got to high school, it was this much more formal process of, going to a location, doing a couple of volunteers hours, getting it signed off so that you could get credit. And I feel like for me, serving others comes from a different place. It comes from a place where I was once in need, and people helped me, and I saw them in need and I helped them because that's the way I grew up. And that's kind of the role that I see for myself in the future is no matter what, the experiences that I've had, I'm going to carry them with me and use that information that I have, that knowledge and empathy, to help other people no matter where I am.
Absolutely. So Rodrigo, to close today's chat, and you provided so much great information, and it's great for you to share your story and your experiences. And I'm wondering, what is one hope or outcome you would like to see for first-generation students in the future?
That's a great question. And one, this is an experience that I had with the Immigrant Scholarship Hustle. We would often evaluate kind of how students were doing, and we would ask them about, their level of confidence with applying to college, of paying for college. And we would have like this summer week-long program, and then the evaluation right after the program, everyone was ecstatic. They were very confident about applying to colleges. And then what we noticed was that over the course of the semester, once we did another evaluation, their confidence levels kind of dropped, and we felt like, yeah, they're probably getting really busy, they're getting stressed out, and then they're kind of losing track of some of the intentions that they had set over the summer. And so one of the hopes or outcomes that I'd like to see for first generation students is like to see students continue to believe in themselves and continue to take care of the intentions that they set for themselves, because it's really important to have that level of confidence and motivation and to take care of yourself, especially during this pandemic. I think it's really important to take time every week and de-stress so so that you can check in with yourself, check in with all the intentions that you are carrying and act upon them. And then, in a larger context too, I'm really hoping that with the new presidential administration that we could see some policy leadership that lowers the cost of college. College is way too expensive. It's getting to a point where it's very ridiculous. And I believe that, and that's a hope that I have in any way, shape, or form that I can. I want to be an advocate for policy that lowers the cost of college for students of color, especially.
Absolutely, yes. And that is a great, forward-thinking mission that I think we all should be committed to. So that's a great way to tie everything together. Thank you so much, Rodrigo, for being a part of this. I greatly appreciate your experiences and your insight. So thank you again for being a part of today's episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Cody. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm excited to see how this episode turns out.
As you can see, fellowships provide students with so many unique opportunities and experiences. We hope hearing the stories of these amazing individuals helps to inspire you or the first-generation student in your life to take advantage of these types of opportunities. Thank you to Raymi and Rodrigo, as well as Marish, Akisha, and Mora from the Harvard Kennedy School for your collaboration. It truly takes a village. As always, you can find us online at howtocollegefirstgen.org if you have any questions or feedback, as we want to hear what you think, what you're struggling with, and how we can help. If you prefer to reach us on social media, you can find us at howtocollegefirstgen on Instagram and Facebook, and HTC Firstgen on Twitter. Remember, you are not alone in this journey. Until next time.